Okay, basically, while the war was raging in Europe, Japan was pushing to try to conquer the Far East. That was their goal that we had talked about before. And in July of 1941, the Japanese even went as far as occupying an area known as French Indochina. French Indochina. Now, normally what happens in this country is if another country does something that we are not approving of, as far as, you know, taking over another country or picking on another country, before we go out and punch them in the nose, we usually do something that'll hurt them economically. Does anybody know what we might do? Cut trade, and it's called freezing their assets. So when Japanese troops occupied French Indochina in July of 1941, President Roosevelt immediately froze all German assets in the United States in protest. And when you freeze assets, that means anything of value in the country that belongs to the country of Japan, they just freeze the assets and they don't give them anything for it. So if you owe them money or they're bringing stuff in, it just doesn't happen. Okay? So, in addition to freezing their assets in the United States, which meant they were basically worthless and wouldn't get paid, he also placed an embargo on the shipment of gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel to Japan. So after the Japanese occupied French Indochina in July of 1941, which was an area in Asia that was controlled by who? France. President Roosevelt immediately froze all Japanese assets in the United States and also placed an embargo on the shipment of gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel to Japan. These were all items that Japan counted on heavily to be imported in from the United States. And he basically stated, not only are we going to freeze all your assets in our country, we're also not going to send you any more gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel. He placed an embargo or a ban on trade. Okay? Well, what did Japan do to retaliate for us freezing all of their assets and not trading with them? They froze all of our assets and put an embargo on certain items that they would be shipping to us, which didn't hurt us as bad because we didn't need their items as much as they needed ours. So basically, trade between the United States and Japan came to a standstill in July of 1941. At that same time, General Hideki Tojo became prime minister, and the military began calling the shots in Japan, not the emperor. So just about the same time as we had this conflict with Japan concerning French Indochina, General Tojo becomes prime minister in 1941, and the government's ruling the country. Now, you understand the difference between a prime minister and a ruler. England is a perfect example of that. The prime minister is like the president of parliament, and of course the king and queen and prince and all that are the royalty. But it's the prime minister that runs the government. Okay? Well, after this whole thing happened in July, on November 20th of 1941, the Japanese government made 3 demands upon the United States. On November 20th of 1941, the Japanese government made the following 4 demands upon the United States.
You said 3.
I'm going to give you 3 then, okay? 3. It says 4 up here and 3 here. Okay, I'll repeat it again. On November 20th, 1941, the Japanese government made the following 3 demands upon the United States. First of all, what do you think they demanded we did? The United States must unfreeze all Japanese assets. The second thing they did, because this is what they needed the most of the things we embargoed, is they demanded that we supply them with as much gasoline as they needed. They didn't say, hey, start selling us gasoline again, they basically stated, you will supply us with as much as we need and more than you want to if that's what we say. So these were pretty insulting demands, really. So the United States must unfreeze Japanese assets. The United States must supply Japan with as much gasoline as it needed. And they also stated that at the time, because we had a decent relationship with China and they did not, that we were to cease all aid to China. We were not to give China any aid of any kind. So again, on November 20th, 1941, the Japanese government made the following three demands upon the United States. One, the United States must unfreeze Japanese assets. Number two, the United States must supply Japan with as much gasoline as it needed. And number three, the United States must cease all aid to China. Well, we obviously didn't meet their demands, but we were trying to be diplomatic, and so we did offer some counter proposals to those demands. Well, on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese announced that further negotiations were useless with the United States. And they began to make plans for an attack on the United States, which actually, in reality, had been planned way in advance of December 7th. So basically, after they decided that we weren't going to work with them, they enacted those plans. Which takes us to our next subtopic, which is the attack on Pearl Harbor and war declared by the United States. Attack on Pearl Harbor and war declared by the United States. And we were, I mean, you know a little bit about Pearl Harbor. I mean, we were completely taken by surprise here. So on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet, which was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And the United States, like I mentioned, was completely taken by surprise, and this attack produced serious losses for the United States. And I'm going to give you three examples of the serious losses that the United States suffered as a result of this Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. You have a map. If you might want to pull that thing out, might give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about here. We're not going to go over this specifically. We're just going to give you some statistics that will give you an idea of the areas that were attacked. I bet you don't have one of those, do you, Tristan? I'll get you one. Here's the first example of the serious damage. 21 ships, American ships, were either sunk or suffered severe damage. 21 American naval ships were either sunk or suffered severe damage. "188 aircraft that were sitting on the ground at Pearl Harbor were destroyed, and another 159 were damaged." 188 aircraft that were sitting on the ground at Pearl Harbor were destroyed, and another 159 were damaged. "2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed. 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed, with an additional 1,178 wounded. 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed, with 1,178 wounded. What was that? It's a lot. The hardest hit battleship in Pearl Harbor was the USS Arizona. And on that ship alone, 1,177 men lost their lives on that ship alone. So the hardest hit battleship was the USS Arizona, in which 1,177 men lost their lives. So of the 2,403 American sailors and soldiers that were killed, 1,177 were killed on that vessel alone. Now that American battleship is still submerged in Pearl Harbor today, and many of those soldiers and sailors that were killed in that air attack are still buried inside the Arizona's hull and have never been recovered. That's one place I've never gone that I've got to get to in my life, is to see that in Pearl Harbor. I guess it's unbelievable. How about Japanese losses in the attack on Pearl Harbor? 64 pilots were killed, 1 was captured. 64 pilots were killed, Japanese pilots were killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor, 1 was captured. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft in the raid, and 5 midget submarines that they had off the coast of Pearl Harbor also were lost. So the Japanese losses in Pearl Harbor were 64 pilots killed, 1 captured, and 29 aircraft lost, along with 5 midget submarines. The next day, on December 8, 1941, is the day that President Roosevelt addressed Congress. He referred to the events at Pearl Harbor as a day, quote, which will live in infamy. The next day, on December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, and he referred to the events at Pearl Harbor as a day, quote, which would live in infamy. After his speech, what did he ask the United States Congress to do there, Morgan? Declare war against Japan. We still have not declared war against the Axis powers in Europe. So President Roosevelt then asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, and Congress granted his request. The Senate voted unanimously to go to war, which means what? Every single person voted for war. In the House, there was only 1 dissenting vote. So Congress passed his request for war unanimously. Everyone in the Senate voted to declare war. The House had 1 dissenting vote. The lone nay vote came from Montana Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin. Does that ring a bell from last year? Jeanette Rankin. Maybe I didn't tell you about her because I was saving it. Jeanette Rankin was incidentally one that voted against America's entrance into World War I as well. So she became the only person in American history to vote against both World War I and World War II, and was the only dissenting vote in Congress at the time. Now, does that mean she's a bad person? You have an assignment that we'll talk about at the end of the period in your binder I gave you that will be due tomorrow, that you'll need to read and answer questions to, and we'll go over that. But when she was confronted about her vote of no for World War II, she said, quote, "I am not running for Congress. I am running for women's suffrage and against war." Okay? Now there's going to be a question on your assignment whether you have a right to vote for what your conscience states as a member of Congress or the constituency. In other words, the people's viewpoints within your state. That's part of that whole process. We'll talk about that later. We'll get to that. Well, 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States because we had declared war on Japan. So on December 11th, 1941, which was 3 days after Roosevelt's speech and the United States' declaration of war upon Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and in turn, Congress declared war on Germany and Italy. So for the United States of America, World War II had begun. And that's how we got ourselves into it. Okay, our next subtopic is somewhat of an emotional subtopic because we have some evidence of this pretty close to here. and that was Japanese removal. And I think it's incredibly important that, especially in the state of Wyoming, that you understand the process behind Japanese removal after Pearl Harbor. Well, as you can imagine, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the west coast of America started to wonder a little bit. And soon residents of the west coast began to fear things like spies and sabotage and further attacks. I mean, you're the closest, really, the west coast is the closest area other than Pearl Harbor. And there was some rumor that the Japanese actually had planned to hit Pearl Harbor and then continue to the coast. And so they probably had some legitimate concerns. Well, as happens, and it's happening today in politics, local politicians and the media whipped up hysteria against Japanese Americans, who at the time were about 112,000 in the country. Okay? So, local politicians, media whip up hysteria about this possible attack by the Japanese on the West Coast, and there becomes a hysteria and a discrimination against Japanese Americans, and they numbered about 112,000 at the time. Most living where? West Coast. Okay? Well, Roosevelt succumbed to that pressure, and early in 1942, he issued a presidential order called Executive Order 9066. So early in 1942, President Roosevelt responded to the anti-Japanese fears, and he issued a presidential proclamation, or Executive Order 9066. And basically what this did, it was a presidential order that authorized the War Department to force Japanese Americans from their West Coast homes and hold them in relocation camps until the war was over. So Executive Order 9066 was a presidential order that authorized the War Department to force Japanese Americans from their West Coast homes and hold them in relocation camps for the rest of the war. Who was in charge of that? A general by the name of John DeWitt. John DeWitt. He was a general that was in charge of the defense of the West Coast. He was given the job of relocating these 112,000 Japanese Americans to relocation camps. Now, what do you think he thought about it? Did he feel bad about it? He kind of wondered, did his conscience get him at all? Here's what he said, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." Can you imagine that today? This is what an American general said publicly when they asked him about the job he had at hand as far as moving these Japanese Americans. He said, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." Can you believe that? I mean, seriously, that's incredible. Well, 67% of these Japanese Americans were native-born American citizens. 67% were born in the United States. So they were just a little bit shocked of the fact that they were going to be just taken from their homes. Now I can tell you that these relocation camps weren't the Hilton Hotel, and they were way worse than most, even poor Japanese people were living in. Okay? So the War Relocation Authority moved prisoners to these hastily built camps, very desolate areas. There were some in California. There were some in Arizona, there were some in Utah, there were some in Colorado, there were some in Idaho, there were some in Arkansas. You necessarily have to write these down. But most importantly, there was one in Wyoming at Hart Mountain, which is not far from here. Well, it's over by Powell. So, in your area, you had a relocation camp for Japanese Americans. Now, in what state were Japanese Americans not imprisoned? Anybody want to guess? They took them from any, you know, most of them are on the West Coast. But any Japanese Americans from across this country were moved to these relocation camps except for the ones that lived in this state. What state do you think that was? Makes absolutely no sense, because it would appear to me that they might be a bigger threat than any other Japanese, if there was such a thing as a threat. Hawaii. If you can believe that, the Japanese Americans that lived in Hawaii, ironically, who presumably would pose a greater threat because of their large numbers and proximity to Japan, were not imprisoned. It was the only state in the country that they did not imprison Japanese Americans, was Hawaii.
Is it because they were already there, and then when they got attacked, they couldn't be, they were getting attacked on?
You know, I'm glad, that's not right, Emily, but it's a good point we're bringing up. It's a good guess. My question would be, why? Why would they do that? Why would they, for God's sake, they provide a possible bigger threat? Why did they do that?
Because it was already attacked?
No.
I don't know that.
They needed them for something, or they wouldn't have moved them.
Oh, to get the planes built back up.
Well, close. Most of the unskilled labor force in the state of Hawaii were Japanese Americans. If they would have sent all those Japanese Americans to relocation camps, the Hawaiian economy would have gone, because all the people that were doing the manual labor were Japanese in that particular, and somebody said, that might have been Emily, that they had a high population of Japanese people. They did, but the key to that was they weren't the executives and the bosses, they were the laborers. And if they sent all those laborers to concentration camps, or not concentration, but it was about like that, to these relocation camps, they wouldn't have anybody to work, and their economy would go down the tubes. Now, not a lot of these Japanese Americans resisted, but one